How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I don't just have one special guest for you. I've got two very special guests for you for today, for this week's episode. Today, I am joined by two strength coaches who are the founders of Data-Driven Strength. Today, I am joined by Josh Pelland and Zac Robinson. How are you both doing? I nearly messed that up there. That was nearly...
It's fine. Don't worry about it. Yeah, we're doing well, man. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Stephen. Looking forward to chatting, man.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. What's been going on in your world? What have you two been up to recently, especially with the last year or so with, COVID, competitions being cancelled and all the madness that's been going on? What's been happening in your worlds?
Yeah, man, with all the COVID stuff, it has allowed us to have a little bit more time to work on some of the data-driven strength stuff. But we're definitely looking forward to some research stuff picking back up in the coming months. So it's been some pros and cons, but yeah, man, with competitions being canceled, it's also been another consideration. But yeah, just kind of using that time for additional things. I know Zac has some recent news that has kind of had some changes in his life with a recent injury. So I'll let him explain that.
I actually collapsed my lung about a month ago.
Oh,
so
wow.
that has been kind of my training has been a little bit derailed from that sense. So that has kind of pushed my priorities in other directions for the moment. But I'm also working on my master's thesis right now, so that's been taking quite a bit of my time as well, and that'll kind of kick up here the next couple of weeks. But yeah, man, it's COVID is hopefully coming towards an end. Knock on every wood table, everyone that's listening, please. But yeah, it's really just kind of shifted where that time has been allocated, but hopefully it's coming to an end here soon.
And all the gyms, because I know the gyms over in the UK are opening back up next week. Probably when this podcast is out, the gyms will probably be back open, but right now they're back opening next week. Are all your gyms back up? Are all your athletes back in training, or have both of you been able to train, at home, or how's that been looking?
Yeah, so in terms of my personal client roster, I have almost everybody back in the gym. I have one guy in Ontario who it just seems like the gyms are never going to open there. And then I have one guy in the UK. And like you said, hopefully by the time this podcast is out, I want to say is it next Monday?
Next Monday, yeah.
Next Monday that they're opening up. So yeah, man, it's been really cool to kind of see how athletes have made do, especially like some younger guys that I coach. Both those guys that I mentioned are younger, and one of them's in an apartment and one of them is at university, and they're just finding a way to get it done. And it's also been a really cool coaching experience because typically you just think about, what training variables am I adjusting? How are we executing top sets? The typical things. But now it's like, okay, motivation is really low. I'm having you do like tempo Cossack squats because it's the only way we can like actually push your lower body musculature to like a decent proximity to failure. And like these guys are still pushing hard. So yeah, man, it's been a learning experience. I don't want to be in their shoes because those guys have been out of the gym for a while. Down here, it's everything's pretty open, but in terms of my coaching roster, there's a couple guys still hanging on, but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I just had my last client. He just got access to equipment a little bit prior to the gym's reopening, so he's been kind of shifted back over to kind of normal training recently. So my roster's all good right now. So hopefully that stays the same. But yeah, it's definitely a different challenge trying to keep people engaged with their training when obviously it's just completely different than what they're accustomed to and what they enjoy to do. So it's definitely hard. And as Josh said, I did it for a little bit of time, and I'm glad I didn't have to do it for very long.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely been, I've got a couple of clients who have been lucky enough to have garage gyms, which has been not much has really changed for them, apart from not being able to train with other people. But yeah, I have found it a little bit of a challenge trying to think of, trying to keep their interest, but also trying to make sure that they're actually getting a training effect. I know in the very first lockdown, lent out loads of equipment for members and clients, and then realised, I think I actually need some equipment. So I just scrambled for.
Too nice, man.
Yeah, I think I took a strongman log and a kettlebell, which I had for about 3 months. So it was like, right, okay, what can I do from there? But luckily, managed to get back. Use the gym as a little bit of an office and get some more powerlifting kits or calibrated plates and some more bars and everything. So there's definitely something more to look forward to. When all the lifters are coming back to the gym next week. Obviously, I did a little bit of a brief introduction there, but for anyone who might not know your backgrounds, how you got involved in, strength training, strength sports and coaching, do you both just want to give a little bit of a background to yourselves?
Sure. I'll kick it off, and then Zac can add on whatever differences we have, because we have pretty similar backgrounds. So we both kind of got into lifting, I think, through playing sports growing up. I know for myself, I was never a freak athlete, but it was kind of the one way I could get an edge was, okay, I'm not super athletic. I'm not super fast. I'm pretty average in terms of, my jumping abilities, et cetera. So the only way I can get an advantage in terms of basketball is like actually being able to move people around. So that's kind of how I got into it myself. And then I went to undergraduate for exercise science. And I kind of stumbled upon some research volunteer opportunities. And that's actually where I met Zac. And we met through research at Ohio State University. And that was kind of Zac had already quote unquote founded Data Driven Strength, just kind of like helping friends out at the collegiate rec center. Right. So, and then he brought me on, and it just kind of evolved from a few people luckily trying us out. And we didn't do too terrible of a job, so they told their friends, and it just kind of grew from there. And it was, I don't think we ever we're like, oh, data-driven strength is going to end up being like what we do, or, it just kind of like organically happened. So it's been a lot of fun. And yeah, these days, I think Zac alluded to it a little bit. We're both research assistants at Florida Atlantic University's muscle physiology lab. Zac's finishing up his master's. He mentioned he's working on his master's thesis. I'm a couple semesters behind him. And then, planning on being in academia for the foreseeable future for sure. So kick it over to Zac if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I almost viewed data-driven strengths in the early days as like analogous to like a glorified lemonade stand. So I definitely would not be anywhere close to where I am now without Mr. Pelland here. But yeah, very similar backgrounds. I don't want to reiterate too much there. I'm just going to call it there because it's literally the exact same. Our interests are pretty much the same, met each other in undergrad, and then we kind of ended up where we're at now. Looking to continue both the practical kind of science communication stuff and also continue, our experience in research and stuff, and hopefully be able to translate that information to lifters kind of across the experience spectrum.
Ah, cool. Do you know, because obviously, especially with the research side of things and the sort of the real world application, this will probably be the first tangent of the chat that we've got today. How have you found that having a hand in both areas has been actually a little bit more beneficial, or maybe not beneficial, but being able to bounce around ideas off each other a little bit more? Because sometimes, there is that train of thought that sometimes the research is sort of catching up what's sort of happening on the gym floor. Have you found that having a hand in both camps, you've been able to have the best of both worlds, if you like, and put plans in place for lifters that's going to benefit them a little bit more?
I think right off the bat, the answer is absolutely. Zac and I talk about this all the time. It's like, I don't think no matter what happens in the coming years, I don't see either of us not having one hand in both at the same time, because I don't think I would be the coach I am without like being also interested in the research. And I don't think I would be able to come up with research ideas or just be able to read the research without having coaching experience in the same way. So I think they're definitely complementary and synergistic in nature. For example, this is actually something Zac and I were talking about yesterday. So Zac mentioned he has a collapsed lung, so his training's been a little bit derailed. And he's like, man, I just don't feel like I've had any like really good training ideas recently.
I literally just wrote that down. Oh, man. So continue.
I stole it from you, but I just thought that was a really good example. Is like, we like to lean on the research a lot, but we also try to incorporate, the practical side of things. And even though our company name is Data Driven Strength, we like to, also cautiously talk about anecdote and, lean on some things that research either isn't equipped to answer, or, you know, like you said, maybe there just haven't been the right study designs yet to answer those questions. And I think a lot of that comes from just kind of using our own training as an experiment and just coming up with ideas while training. I just view my training as like, yeah, I like to train, and I want to get big and strong in the long term, but this is kind of just like an experiment and a way for me to get my wheels turning and try out things I want to try with clients, try out things that, you know, I'm potentially interested from a research perspective. So yeah, man, I definitely think that they complement each other. And for me personally, and I assume I speak for Zac here, it's like, I wouldn't want to go too far in either direction, and always kind of keep a balance there.
Yeah, I think the main thing that it does in my mind is it just makes you aware of the limitations on both ends. So when you're looking to answer a question that you're looking to apply to like a training population from a research perspective, if you're never actually in the trenches and doing the thing yourself, you just have no idea that some limitations exist, like generalizing conclusions from certain exercises to the exercises we use in practice. For example, like in a purely scientific perspective of like controlling as many variables as possible, like isometric resistance training or single joint resistance training, that's probably going to be the way to go. But from the practical side of things, obviously that's not what we're doing. And so when we look to just generalize those findings over to practice, we need people that are actually implementing these ideas to see if our conclusions hold up. Because from a high level point of view, bird's eye view perspective, the average person is going to look at that saying, yeah, you're still lifting weights. What's the difference? But in reality, when you're actually doing the thing yourself, you realize there's a ton of differences in the limitations of the research that when you actually put this into practice, you start to pick up on. And the same is true in the opposite direction too. So you have coaches that, when you're working with clients, you're presented with problems and you theoretically might find a solution, but the reason that is solving the problem may be slightly different than what you are anticipating based on your past experiences and your biases as a coach limited to that experience. So that's what the research process kind of helps us to do is, okay, you have found these solutions on the ground, but what is the actual mechanistic cause of that kind of solution, so that when we encounter future problems, we can take that logic and kind of hopefully come to a faster solution more quickly and kind of diagnose the situation earlier.
Yeah, definitely. And like what you've said there, you can be able to, strike that balance. I think sometimes, I think a lot more coaches and lifters are, trying to have a hand in, both camps rather than just taking it as gospel as what, research is saying. And just from what you've both chatted about there, it leads quite nicely on to sort of the first question and the first topic that I sent over is, obviously, every lifter is different. And there's other things that you've got to take into account, lifestyle, body biomechanics and all that sort of stuff. But obviously from a research point of view, like what you mentioned there, Zac, about, the generalistic type of view that, okay, so this is the plan that works, but, for 5 out of 10 people that might work, or 6 out of 10 people, but the other, you might have to change those around. So in terms of the programming and how you work with your lifters, how individualized can you actually make the program, dependent on the systems that you use when lifters come and work with you, if that kind of makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Stephen. And I think that question really emphasizes an important consideration when translating the research to practice is that the research is done on averages, kind of like Zac mentioned. And yes, this might work on average. This might work for 7 out of 10 people, like you said, or this might be the best approach for 7 out of 10 people. But as you mentioned, what about those other 3 out of 10 people? And also another thing to keep in mind is the people that are going to pursue online coaching are going to seek assistance from a coach at some capacity. There's probably going to be a selection bias for those 3 out of 10 individuals that aren't responding to kind of the general guidelines. So I kind of view the research as a starting point. And something that I always like to say is that I think being evidence-based is, yes, using, best practices from the research, but also understanding its limitations and incorporating that uncertainty and those limitations into practice. So one of the primary limitations is what I said, is that the research is done on the averages, and the results you get, the effect sizes you get, those are for the averages, those 3 out of 10 individuals, what are you going to do for them? So for example, there's some research to indicate, I'm thinking of one study by Damas and colleagues in particular, where they had each individual trained one leg with like a lower training volume, and they had their other leg on a higher training volume. And on average, the leg that was on the higher training volume saw greater growth and greater strength gains. But for some individuals, that relationship was inversed. So yes, on average, we know that, there's a decent dose response relationship between training volume and the results you get. But for some individuals, it might be the opposite. So, it's common to hear these days, hey, if you're not making progress on a lift, probably your first bet to troubleshoot is to bump up the training volume a little bit. I agree that's a solid recommendation based on the research. I believe a study by Abe and colleagues, there's some indication that that's especially the case. But if you look, I might be messing up the lead author here, but I think it's the study by Abe and colleagues. But if you look at the individual data points a little bit closer, some lifters actually do better when they reduce their training volume. So again, the idea here is, yes, we can look at these p-values, we can look at these effect sizes for the averages as a starting point, but you also have to understand that these aren't hard and fast rules. So I think this is where individualization really comes in, and where you have to stray from best practices that we gain from the research. So that's kind of my off the cuff answer. I don't know if Zach, you have anything to add there.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to say is that we often have these conversations in the frame of programming, and that's natural because it's obviously one of the first modifiable factors that we think of in terms of kind of modifying these things. But I do think it's a more complicated equation than just saying some people respond to high volume, some people respond to low volume, because you have to take into account other things like the psychological perception of the training. So for example, so you kind of have two sides of that coin. One side of that coin is, do I believe or do I have buy-in that this training is going to lead to positive adaptations? Regardless of what the training is, if you have that, it's probably going to lead to better outcomes, all else being equal. Additionally, if you enjoy the training, that's probably going to lead to more focus, more intent when you're actually executing the training. And I think most coaches would agree the actual execution of what's on the spreadsheet is more important than what's on the spreadsheet itself. So the overall way that I like to think about this is not necessarily, just the do you respond to this, but it's kind of this net stimulus that takes into account all of these factors, saying there's a net stimulus that this person responds to, and we have to find the kind of navigation of these variables to make us kind of move forward, rather than saying, okay, this person needs a high volume program because that is what the individualization principles dictate they will make progress on. Rather, there's kind of this landscape of things that we need to take into account and kind of, twist some dials and get all of our ducks in a row to make sure this person can move forward, which is a little bit more of an art than it is a science a lot of time.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen, just to put a quick bow on what Zach said, I think that's a really good point. And I didn't really touch on that because it didn't come to mind initially, but that's probably the biggest thing is you can give two individuals the same exact spreadsheet, the same exact training protocol, but based on how they execute, it can be a totally different training stimulus. And another way to think about that is you can give two people the same training program, but kind of instruct them to execute it differently and, kind of based on athlete personality type. So I have one athlete in particular who he actually does not he's the opposite of a lot of people in that he doesn't push himself super hard on his top sets. Whereas a lot of people like to get psyched up, maybe prone to overshoot, that kind of thing. But this guy, he's not really that personality type. So I have to put in a spreadsheet and remind him, hey man, this is week 4, 5, and 6 of the block. As we've talked about from previous training cycles, this is when it's really time to push, right? So that's an example of how do we take this existing protocol and actually layer on the actual coaching aspect, which you can't really get from the research, because in the research, we're literally trying to standardize everything. When you're taking subjects through a resistance training protocol, you have to make things, you're really not influencing them at all, right? Because that will add confounders into the study design. So the point being is research, we're really trying to control things and isolate, okay, is higher training volume or lower training volume better? But then in practice, it's we have all these different dials we can turn. And, that's kind of where the art of coaching comes in, where a study will never really tell you how to do that. So the research is getting the concepts, getting the principles, and then how do we apply this to practice, turn all those little fine dials based on the individual. So yeah, that just wanted to kind of put a bow on that and ramble a little bit more because I like this topic.
Yeah, definitely. I thought that was, two really good, answers there and explanations. And obviously we spoke there about, what you can change in terms of the program side of things, and, touched on a little bit of the coaching side. And you both mentioned sort of the lifter's mindset and, their personality, taking it a little bit of a step back before you sort of get to the programming side of things. What are you looking for, or what are the key points that you're trying to take down when a lifter first comes to you? Because I think sometimes there is, a train of thought that certain lifters will gravitate towards certain coaches and styles. And what's the starting point in terms of, right, I'm going to use, this is the research that I've looked at. This is our starting point. And then do you adjust then depending on their personality, and what are the key signs that you're looking for when you're looking to actually make it a little bit more individualized? Because I know sometimes a lifter can come in, especially the online coaching side of things is massively blown up, that bespoke programs, everything's going to be individualized, it's a super duper magic program for them. But actually sometimes the starting point, like what we've touched on there, sometimes you need to start off quite general of what we know works in terms of the research, and then try and filter out and make sure that it's like, right, okay, like the client that you mentioned, Josh, all right, this is the point where we need to push a little bit more. So yeah, what's sort of the process behind that, or your processes behind that?
Zac, you want to kick that off, or you want me to give it a go?
Yeah, I can. So I think the first thing to start with is that when we're talking about individualization, it's kind of impossible to get anywhere if you don't start with some initial constraints. And that's kind of something we all often talk about is like, if you're just starting from square zero, we need to have evidence to say that, resistance training is the thing that makes us stronger in the first place. Like, why am I not doing some other random activity like raking my leaves? Like, you know what I mean? You need to start with some baseline assumptions and baseline constraints in order to move forward. So I think that's going to be coach dependent. I don't think there's a right way to do that. But, and like you said, there's obviously some selection bias that occurs between coaches and people that perceive different methods to be positive, and that's totally fine. But once you have a method or kind of a system that you're going to go with to help you kind of individualize things over time, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that some variables are inherently more flexible than others. And that's going to allow you to navigate kind of some still theoretically optimal programming around the subjective constraints of the individual, what they enjoy, what they buy into, all that kind of thing. So one that comes to mind, for example, is like hypertrophy. For example, we can have muscle growth with loads ranging from like around 30% of 1RM, probably all the way up to 100% of 1RM. So if somebody just desperately hates doing low rep sets or high rep sets or one of the two, we can kind of navigate their volume work to one end of the spectrum to align with their subjective preferences, inevitably increasing their intent, increasing their focus, and likely increasing their buy-in, which ultimately is going to manifest in better outcomes down the line anyway. So I think that's like the first thing to keep in mind as a coach, is that there are some of these variables that are way more flexible than others. I think a couple more that come to mind is probably frequency. You have a ton of, room to kind of mess around with things there. Exercise selection, I think, especially for like hypertrophy movements, there's a ton of individualization there. We don't have to do all of our work on the competition lifts. We can kind of spread that out in varying amounts depending on the individual. And then on the other end of things, like one example that I like to kind of share to say in general is probably going to be, it's pretty similar between individuals, would be like load, for example, for strength. So I would say pretty much for everyone, greater loads is going to be better for strength than lower loads. Now, the exact calculus of like how you would put that on a program is going to be, again, encapsulating all these other factors: fatigue management, how do they psychologically view a single at 90% on paper, like all these other things that would go into actually how you write that on a piece of paper. But the kind of the trend, heavier loads are better for strength, I think is a fairly safe assumption for most people. So again, that kind of just adds to your constraint bucket where we can actually start navigating towards this smaller pool of variables that we can kind of navigate around the individual's preferences to hopefully lead to better outcomes. But kind of an example of why we focus so much on the subjective stuff that some people think maybe is a little foo-foo and less important is like, I come back to these placebo steroid studies where they give individuals, you know, these essentially sugar pills, and they tell them that they're anabolic steroids, and the strength gains are absolutely unreal. So it just shows how much positive expectations influence your outcomes. And if an athlete negatively views the training program for, you know, if the coach is saying, no, we have to only do the competition lifts with heavy loads because that's specificity, and you're just not taking into account all of these subjective preferences, I think you're ultimately going to lead to kind of that net stimulus or net outcome being a little bit lower. So that'd be kind of the first thing that came to mind.
Zach, I think that answer was excellent. I don't think I have anything to add, man. The one thing that does come to mind, and I think Zach was kind of hinting at this, is that individualization is not the first week of programming you write for an athlete. It's probably not even the first block or the first training cycle. So kind of what you said, Steven, is like, we can get a starting point from their previous insights. Maybe they've been pretty in tune with their training. Hey, I've ran this template. I've ran this program. I ran starting strength a while back. This is how it went. We can get some insights to inform the starting point. And I think that is important. Don't get me wrong. But to me, where the individualization actually occurs is down the line. Like, I view the individualization process as getting better over time. Like I kind of use this example quite often is, you know, you sit down to write the first training cycle for an individual, and there's a lot of guesswork. But, you know, my athletes that I've been working with for multiple years, when I sit down and I write a new training cycle for them, it takes me a lot less time, and I don't want to say less effort, but there's less guesswork, because it's like, oh, we've tried that before. It doesn't really work for you. And we've also retested that hypothesis. It doesn't really work for you. Whereas on the other hand, okay, we're pretty confident that this is the way we should configure your top sets in a hypertrophy phase for your squats. You know, okay, we're going to stay somewhere around there. Now there's this extra category. These are still things we're experimenting with, and it takes time, right? Because I don't think you can like be in week 4 of a training block and be like, oh, that change we made 4 weeks ago it's not working. It's like, it's been 4 weeks, man. Like there's no way to really detect progress at this point. So in order to actually see whether these things play out, you need sufficient time. So that leads to the individualization process taking time, because if I think a lot of athletes fall into this trap is, oh, I'm going to hop on this new 10-week program. Oh, week 4, I haven't hit a PR yet. It's time to jump to another program. It's like, well, you can do that. Nobody's going to stop you. It's your training. But if you at least finish the 10-week program, let's say worst case scenario, it doesn't work out. At least you know that it doesn't work out, right? And you have that information going forward. So that's just kind of my ramble of that. Individualization, yes, you can inform the starting point using a combination of the research, using a combination of their insights, using a combination of, you know, different patterns you've noticed in your coaching practice. Oh, this individual is always talking about how his lower body's smoked every single week and he hasn't made any progress. Okay, let's see how we can configure this dose of training and make it a little bit more sustainable. Those are, of course, things that can inform the starting point. But when you are making adjustments, at the end of the day, we need to keep the goal, and the goal is progress. And we can use these subjective measures as proxies to kind of indicate, you know, the best next steps in terms of troubleshooting. But at the end of the day, we need to see whether the results actually manifest. And then we can use the subjective input to inform the direction we take the troubleshooting. So individualization takes time, and it's not something that can be rushed, unfortunately. So yeah, those are kind of my 2 cents. I hope we actually answered your question, Steven.
Yeah,
I have another tangent unless you got a question, Steven.
No, I was just the from listening to both sort of the answers there. It is, you know, you said there at the end that, you know, after 4 weeks, people are expecting to have, you know, be hitting PBs. And I think the biggest thing that, especially what I try and speak to my lifters, is that especially with strength training, it is a game of patience. You know, you've got to give time to let things grow and develop, and, you know, see if they actually get results. And especially with, you know, from beginners, they're not going to need a massive amount of, you know, hitting from the stuff that we've read in research. They're probably going to make actually quite good gains from there. And especially with the individualization side of things, is, you know, that'll develop over time. And like what you said about the okay, so we've used this before, that didn't work, let's try and use this, rather than, I think, from a coaching point of view, sometimes a lot of coaches can sometimes throw a lot at lifters and be like, right, we're going to make this a really individual program, we're going to try and correct everything at once, rather than thinking, right, you know, for powerlifting, weightlifting, you know, maybe, you know, even the strongman side of things, you're not going to be competing every single week. So the biggest thing for powerlifting is that you've got time to experiment with these things. Whereas at the beginning, you know, we want to make sure that we've got progress, see what works, and then exactly like what you've mentioned, then we can start rotating things around and changing things. Because even from the programming side of things, yeah, this is what we're doing. But from the I think you mentioned it there, of the art of coaching earlier on. That's when you build the relationship with the athlete, and the better you understand the athlete, understand the lifter, then you can make a little bit more accurate decisions and know what they're doing a little bit more, rather than just thinking, you know, this on the piece of paper that we've got, or you know, the spreadsheet that we've got, this is the only thing that's gonna help you get stronger.
Yeah, so I think an analogy is a lot of time. And one thing that I just thought of that I thought was a pretty good representation of kind of a mistake that I made a ton early on was, you know, we talked about setting these constraints and having a system. So if you take like an example of somebody that was trying to guess the speed of a car, and one person stayed in the exact same position when they were given 10 cars and told the speed, versus one person that was just moving all in different positions while guessing the speed, the person that stays in the exact same position to evaluate the relative difference between cars, I think is going to be more effective in guessing the speed of like an 11th car. Now, the way that applies to coaching is, I think if you don't have a system in which you are consistently doing things and kind of in that method, which we've talked about, there's a ton of different ways you can do it. But the meaningful part of that is staying consistent allows you to learn faster from patterns that you've seen from different athletes, because you're putting them through a similar process. And that allows you to get to that point of individualization probably a little bit faster, because when I have athlete A versus athlete B, I can kind of see similar trends to say, oh, on average, this kind of trend that I'm seeing in my particular way of doing things leads me to try this option of kind of twisting the dials first rather than this other option. And that's where you can actually use your experience to your advantage, rather than, like you said, Steven, throwing the kitchen sink at things with all these different changes in the middle of a block. And now you have essentially gained zero information. And as a coach that even has been doing things for a long time, you've essentially not gained any of your experience to build to your pattern recognition ability in your kind of way of doing things. So I think that analogy to me kind of just really crystallized, like, pick a system, whatever that is, of kind of the way you're going to evaluate training and kind of the unit in which you're going to, okay, I'm going to run this block. And then after this block, I'm going to kind of evaluate how things went, and I'm going to make tweaks. You can do it at the block, you can do it at the training cycle, you can do it at like the micro cycle. It doesn't really matter. Pick a system that you're comfortable with and you think makes the most sense for the athletes that you work with and your personal way of doing things. And then from there, keep consistent with that and actually gain your experience and your ability to recognize patterns within your own system. Because I think inevitably that'll start decreasing the time it takes to get in that kind of Pareto principle effective zone of individualization for the person, rather than making it a little bit, longer down the line. So hopefully that helped a little bit. A lot of times analogies only make sense to me, but I thought that made pretty good sense.
I like it. I'm gonna make a note. I'm always on the. I'm a big fan of analogy myself. So yeah, if you hear me saying it again, I'll be like, right, that's it, copyright.
I just have one quick thing to add, Zach. I really like that analogy. I just one kind of caveat I want to make sure is clear is Zac kind of mentioned having some sort of system, and I 100% agree with that. But the one thing I want to add. And this is in an effort to avoid anything that resembles gatekeeping. I think that's something Zac and I are definitely trying to work on. Is like, yes, we tend to lean in the science direction, which tends to have jargon. Okay, how can we make this accessible to as many people as possible? And even if you want to, look into the services we have to offer or not. I want you to be able to do this on your own if you want to as well. Or, you know, the college student who has literally zero money to spend on a coach or whatever. I want them to be able to do this too. So point being, like, just because we say have some sort of system, that doesn't mean it has to be this super nuanced.
It's not a complicated thing.
Yeah. It's just the point being is like, make it systematic as opposed, like, maybe that's a better way to say is make it systematic. You don't like, yes, within our quote unquote system, we have these, you know, kind of periodization things we do. And like, we do think they're better. We think there's a reason we do them, but like, at the end of the day, as long as it's systematic and you're kind of over time decreasing the error bars around the kind of training formula that works best for you, that's what it's all about. It's not that it has to be some super fancy nuanced system. Just make it systematic.
Yeah, I think you can boil it down to two very simple kind of ways of making it systematic. Evaluate training on a similar time span. So pick your whatever distance of time you want to do that, 1, 6, 12 weeks, doesn't matter. And 2, make changes based on that unit. So don't like just completely start from scratch every single time. Say, okay, this is how this piece of training went. Now I'm going to write a new block and I'm going to use that as my starting point and kind of make a few changes to that at a time rather than like completely starting in a different direction. There's a time and place to kind of go in a different direction, of course, but in general, being systematic probably means, okay, this is what I just did. Using that as my starting point, let's make a few incremental changes over time and try to get in the direction and use that experience from that last block to hopefully lead to better outcomes. So yes, I totally agree with Josh. We definitely don't want to make this overcomplicated because it's really not. It's actually simplifying the training process and making the mystique around periodization, all this stuff, throw that in the trash, doesn't need to be a thing. Find an approach that's systematic. Pick a time unit that seems reasonable for your rate of progress, but also the way you like to do things and kind of that thing. And then also use your past training as your starting point and make incremental changes. That's as complicated as it needs to be. And I would agree that systematic is probably a better word.
Yeah, you both mentioned the same thing. You know, it doesn't matter what system it is, you know, because as you were both speaking, sort of my train of thought, there was a point way before COVID and people would just walk into the gym and train whenever they wanted at whatever time. There was a lot of lifters came in who were didn't have a coach at the time, but you know did a little bit of their own programming or were following programs like the 5-3-1 or starting strength or whatever it may be. And in their own head, they had a system. And you know, after speaking to them on the gym floor, it's I'm doing this and I'm trying to track this and I'm trying to do this. And actually, it got to the point where, you know, through the powerlifting club, then getting on board with, you know, coaching with myself, actually, you know, that's where a lifter coming and working with a coach, a lifter can sometimes, because there's loads of information out there, you know, you can type in on Google and they're gonna find something and find a system that they think, oh, actually, you know, I'm gonna give that a go. And then the role of a coach is, you know, coming in and saying, right, well, what if we were about to try this? And exactly like you said, just simplifying it a little bit rather than thinking it needs to be this convoluted, you know, crazy thing that needs to get them progress. As long as there is progress there, and making sure that, right, okay, can we actually track what's going on? Can we measure, you know, what's going on? And we've spoken a lot about the actually developing individualization in programming. But one thing that I wanted to touch on is obviously when you're looking at, you know, lifters who are intermediate going on to the advanced level side of things, and you both touched on that, you know, when it gets to a point of, you know, what works, and then that's when it's going to change. You see some of the top level lifters who are doing similar programs and are just playing around with certain things. How much can they get out of sort of maybe recycling those programs, and where are you then going to have a look and see, you know, rather than the beginners get into intermediate side of things where, you know, you don't have to, you know, changing things around can make a little bit of a big difference. At the top level, when as people have been lifting a little bit longer, the amount of things that you need to change are going to be a little bit smaller. So what's kind of the process to still make them, you know, keep making progress, and obviously, you know, to keep that sort of enjoyment of training, if you like, rather than just recycling programs that they know have been able to get them stronger. Does that kind of make sense? What I said? So
just to make sure, I think that's an awesome question. Just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, you're basically asking, like, okay, once you kind of get to the cusp of being an advanced lifter where progress is a little bit harder to come by, your question is, how much can you get out of like repeating the same thing? I think that's an awesome question. I really quick, while it's kind of at the top of my mind, I think the enjoyment part that you mentioned is important to consider, because we can talk about what's best on paper. But at the end of the day, if the intent for training isn't there, and that's a downstream effect of low enjoyment for training, that's going to be a negative, and that needs to be accounted for. But I think this question ultimately gets to the point of whether resensitization is a thing. And based on the research right now, it is a thing. But the question is it a thing that actually will lead to a net improvement in the long run? So in other words, if you take individuals and you have them like not train for a while, and then you put them back on training, their rate of progress is going to be greater, and they typically end up around the same spot as the group that just trained through. So their rate of progress is better. But the question is, can we configure this in a way so that their rate of progress is better? So again, I know that's not super relevant because that's not what people are doing in the gym. But point being is resensitization is a thing. It's just a matter of whether it's relevant here. Zach, looks like you have something to say.
I would say the one caveat with those studies that I think there's a huge gap in the literature that we need to find out is generally those studies are when people completely stop training. Can we have some sort of maintenance dose of training that minimizes the kind of the downslope when you're significantly decreasing training volume to allow us to end up at a greater point? Because like Josh said, it does seem that in some situations, the rate of progress can increase. Now, the question on the coaching end, which I think people have kind of been trying to do this for a while, is how do we configure training to maximize the benefits of this sort of resensitization effect while minimizing the downsides of detraining? And we know that doing considerably less training volume allows you to maintain adaptations pretty well. In one study, there's like a ninth to a third of training volume seems to maintain adaptations. Now, that's not well-trained lifters that are pulling 400 kilos. So that's a little bit completely different population. But the point being, you can probably maintain adaptation on significantly less training volume than you took to get there. So the real question is, how low can we go to get the resensitization effect, but also allow us to maintain or even continue building progress a little bit and kind of leverage both sides of those camps? Josh, I don't know if you had anything else to add with your answer. I had some other things to say, but different directions. So go ahead, finish.
Yeah, I'll go really quick. I think we probably got too far down the resensitization rabbit hole because it's not super relevant to your question, Stephen, but it is loosely relevant. So basically my thought process is, okay, we just ran a given unit of training. Let's say it was a 12-week training cycle. If we rerun it, like let's say that training cycle went well, if we rerun it, can we expect similar results? Or is there an inherent benefit to changing the training cycle? And my hunch is that I think there probably isn't like on paper an inherent benefit to changing the training cycle. And we are probably proponents of, hey, let's repeat that. But I would circle back to what Zac said earlier. What are the things we have flexibility on? At the end of the day, if we have a slot where the protocol is, hey, let's accumulate 4 sets in the 8 to 12 rep range, landing around RP8 on a leg press to really get some good quad hypertrophy, you have a little bit of flexibility there. And Stephen, going to your point of enjoyment, okay, for next cycle, maybe to keep things fresh, to keep things exciting, maybe we move them to a hack squat next cycle. That's a very simple example. But the point being is, I think once you have a configuration of training that is proven to work well for that individual, I think you can more or less repeat cycles. But here's the caveat. The caveat is that the target kind of moves over time. The athlete that responded well to that training cycle 3 cycles ago is no longer the same athlete, right? They have all this, they have more experience under their belt. Maybe they have a slightly different life circumstance, etc. So to directly answer your question, I don't think on paper there's a reason to think, there's going to be an inherent benefit to changing things up from a physiological point of view, but from a psychological point of view, depending on the athlete, that's when you can start changing things where you have some flexibility. So that's where my head goes for that question, Zach. Clean that up.
Yeah, I guess I kind of interpreted the question differently. I kind of heard what you were asking is essentially how does the individualization process change as someone gets more advanced? And kind of the bullet points that I wrote down is the first and foremost kind of problem, I suppose, is that progress obviously gets way harder to measure. So you have an intermediate athlete that realistically can put, 5 kilos on their lift per cycle. That's pretty easy to kind of tell what works and what doesn't work if strength is what you're kind of after. But the stronger these athletes get, and that becomes more and more unrealistic each cycle, that obviously makes the individualization process a little bit more difficult. And so you have a few options there. You can increase kind of the length of the unit in which you're individualizing things from. And hopefully that can kind of, at the end of those cycles, you can kind of realistically expect that they put, load on whatever tester, configuration you're using for a set or not. And then you can kind of go from there. But I think that is something you need to stare in the face. And the other thing is, this is something we talk about all the time, is like more of a philosophical question of like, how are you determining what works? Because, for a strength athlete, it's relatively objective in the sense that you're trying to add, weight to the bar and the competition movements by the competition standards. But is that always what we're after? And especially in periods farther away from competition, I would say it's probably not the primary objective and not what should determine, is this training quote unquote working? Now this is like another rabbit hole we can go down for a while, but the point being, especially training for hypertrophy, a successful cycle or successful block may manifest differently than what is considered successful for strength. And I think for advanced athletes, that's especially important, because if you're constantly having these blocks that don't seem to, on their face, be leading you to positive adaptations to weight on the bar in the immediate, that doesn't mean that that's not a successful cycle or block and leading you towards the ultimate destination of when you get on the platform for those meets that actually matter. That training that you just did for block after block, for cycle after cycle, training with high volumes, generally in a higher repetition range at a higher proximity to failure, that's probably going to build a significant amount of muscle mass that hopefully can manifest to PRs on the platform. So I think taking a step back and just philosophically realizing how do we define what works is something, the more advanced you get, is something you need to kind of toy with in your mind and realize that short-term immediate progress of adding weight to the bar isn't always probably the outcome that we're after. Another thing I put in all caps on my thing is environment matters. And so I think the more advanced you get, there's kind of this distance of the environment the athlete is training in, nutrition, sleep, stress, all this stuff. The distance that needs to be on point for adaptations to manifest starts to just narrow and narrow and narrow the more advanced the athlete gets. So if we're in a period of significant life stress, nutrition is poor, sleep is poor, that's just something that needs to be understood. And a more novice lifter, they can probably get away with that. You see a ton of novices that are partying and drinking every weekend, coming to the gym, hungover on a Monday, still hitting PRs. Like, that's just the way it goes when you start training. But, the more advanced you get, a lot of those things need to be continued to be dialed in. And understanding that from like a longer term periodization and training planning perspective, if there's periods of someone's life where that environment just simply isn't realistic to allow them to continue to push, there might be some training modifications that I need to make. Somebody gets a new job, they have a child, they're having maybe some relationship stress from family members or something like that. Like, that's just probably not going to be a time in training when things are going to go well. And you need to expect that from the coaching end. And maybe that's when you take advantage of some of these resensitization strategies and something like that, where you can kind of pair those periods of higher life stress where we really taper back the training workload to hopefully try to make a positive out of that situation. But the point being, from a coaching perspective, you can look at the spreadsheet, look at the numbers, look at the programming for as many hours as you want. But if the environment is not in its necessary position to allow progress to manifest, it probably isn't going to, the more advanced you get. So that was, I think that's pretty much everything I got. That was a long enough ramble.
No, I think it is, it doesn't matter how much you talk about, programming and exercise selection and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes, the and I like to call it sort of the low hanging fruit, because as you're progressing, you know, those things are never going to go away. You know, the strength and progress is always going to be limited if you're only getting 4 hours of sleep, if you're eating rubbish. And it's one of those things where I think sometimes, you mentioned there about, you know, actually how are you going to track progress? Sometimes actually seeing a plateau or a maintenance of strength. Look, you know, are we eating enough heading into the session? Are we getting enough recovery? I know, you know, as I've progressed with my lifting, that actually, you know, you've got to spend some time putting some attention into that, which is, from a coach's point of view, is sometimes the lifter is so fixated on the program that when you're trying to point them in the direction, they can feel as though they're trying to be knocked off course. Whereas actually addressing those things, keeping the program the same, you're probably going to get a little bit more out of that. One thing, sort of, from what you were both saying there, and, you know, looking at their programming, and there's been a lot of, we've touched on it a little bit in terms of actually making decisions around, you know, right, what are we going to change? What are we going to, what we're going to add in? What are we going to take away? And how are you, when it comes to athlete monitoring, which I think is, you know, obviously really, really important, but not necessarily, I think maybe a lot of coaches and lifters are still trying to figure out, you know, what they should be looking for. So in terms of the lifters that you're working with in your athlete monitoring process, what are you looking for to make as much accurate decisions as you can? Because I think sometimes, you know, coaches are sometimes worried that they're going to get it wrong, or they're focusing on, I need this to be 100% right. This is exactly what it's going to be, rather than, you know, making sure that they don't get it wrong, but they're heading in the right direction, if that makes sense. So what's kind of the systems that you use, and what do you two look for?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I wish there was one single metric that I could point to and say, this is it. But there's not. So the way that I like to conceptualize it when I'm working one-on-one with something is, we have a ton of different factors, and each of these factors are indicators. Some of these indicators are going to be stronger indicators than others. But they're all indicators that kind of go into the mental model when I'm actually making a training decision. Do I have a distinct algorithm for it? No. Again, this is kind of where the art of coaching goes in. And is this prone to cognitive biases? Probably. But I think I don't think there's a single metric that we can kind of rely on. So in terms of our coaching process, when working one-on-one with someone, the factors that come to mind are, first and foremost, conversation and getting a feel for how things are feeling for that individual. So a couple of questions that come to mind are, hey, how confident are you going into this top set? You know, do you feel sufficiently practiced, or do you feel like you have the skill to execute this top single at an RP8? Or do you feel like the way we've configured your training, you just don't have the confidence or the skill to execute that well and to progress it over time? If the answer to that is no, that's probably an indication we need to adjust the way we're prescribing that strength practice. Another question that comes to mind is just how beat up and how fatigued they're feeling, and that can largely come from conversation. So this is a very simplified way of thinking about training, but I think it holds some water, and of course it has limitations. And the way of thinking about it is, if you're not progressing well, you're probably either doing too much or too little. Now, of course, that's within reasonable constraints. And again, that's not perfect, but if progress is unsatisfactory, you can get some indication based on how beat up they're feeling, how fatigued they're feeling, of whether you need to up the dose or decrease the dose. Again, that's just kind of a rough model. Beyond conversation, I think stuff that we do is we track session RPE. Again, there's some limitations to session RPE, but just asking, hey man, how hard was that session? Are you consistently hanging out around a 2 out of 10 session RPE, or are you consistently rating these session RPEs as a 6 out of 7? We also ask some subjective questions weekly, just based on some athlete monitoring stuff with the assistance of actually one of my clients. He helped us make these. He's did his master's degree in athlete monitoring, and he kind of adapted some of the athlete monitoring literature for powerlifting, and it asks questions like overall well-being, overall sickness, upper and lower body soreness, aches and pains, those kind of things. Again, each of those in isolation on a week-to-week basis probably doesn't hold a lot of ground. But if we can look at, okay, how are these trending? Where is this individual kind of hanging out? That can inform the direction we head in terms of the individualization process. The very last point I want to make is that the way that I think about it is as we make changes cycle after cycle, let's say we were at 10 units of training dose for their bench press and it didn't go well in that first 12-week training cycle. Okay, we decided based on some subjective input and conversation, we're going to bump that up to 12 units of training dose for cycle 2. That didn't go well. Maybe we continue to go up, or maybe we end up in the long term at 7 units of training dose. So basically the point being is you can kind of test and retest over time, and you might go the wrong direction, but because you have the information from going that direction, you can kind of make the decision going forward. So point being is when you've been working with someone for 2 or 3 years, you know that, hey, we tried going that direction. It didn't go well. So that's another thing to factor into your decision-making. So Zac, I'll pass it over to you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would say my kind of overall kind of bumper sticker thing that I try to follow with athlete monitoring are 2 things: is keep it simple, and then kind of a subsection of that is, does this actually influence my management? If no, don't track it, because that simply is just going to cloud your picture of actually what you're trying to evaluate. And more data is definitely not always better. And as Josh said, a lot of our views on this are kind of formed by one of his clients, Drake Esserhout, he's the man for athlete monitoring stuff. I would definitely give him a follow. But yeah, he's very clear that more data is definitely not always better, which I think a lot of people, based on the name of our company, would probably be like, oh, that's kind of a weird thing for them to say. But that's definitely the way we view it. And kind of using one of your terms you said, Stephen, I think my kind of mission with athlete monitoring stuff is to identify subjective low-hanging fruit. So, we use these measures, session RPE, the kind of weekly questionnaires, that kind of stuff. As Josh said, it's kind of just to identify conversation starters. And then once you have those conversations, what you're doing by those pointed questions is kind of 2 things. So when I ask somebody, do you feel confident with heavy loads? That both is going to tell me kind of maybe some physiological things of like, maybe they need more strength practice for neuromuscular efficiency or whatever you're talking about. But also, I think that is going to identify the psychological things of indirectly getting at buy-in, intent, focus, all those other things that are both going to equally affect the training. So when we're asking those questions, it's kind of, on one hand, like, this is going to directly impact my programming, but it's going to do that for multiple reasons. Not only is that going to actually be targeted at some physiological adaptations, but it's also going to be like, I would say if this person doesn't feel like they're answering the question to say, I don't feel practice with heavy loads, they probably want some more practice with heavy loads for a variety of reasons to buy into the training more. They would enjoy it. They have more focus, all the kind of downstream effects for that. So I think that's a reasonable change to make. And of course, that's going to be influenced by the overall conversation with the athlete that will kind of color that picture a little bit more and give you some more context. But yeah, those kind of 2 things, keeping it simple, and actually, if I'm tracking this, is it going to influence my management, I think should be the way you kind of, guide your athlete monitoring process to make sure you're not overcomplicating things. So I think as long as you have like some measure of performance that you're going to use, and then you're also going to have some psychological stuff that can be those conversation starters, whatever that, is for you, I think you're probably in a good spot. But just don't have too much, because I think we've definitely went down that road of making it way, way, way too complicated. And then you start just losing the forest from the trees, and then you don't get anything out of the athlete monitoring data, which obviously isn't what we want either. We want to be very targeted and make sure that we're actually getting the benefit that we can get from it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned there about, sometimes you can have too much data. And I know for me, I know a couple of coaches that work within sort of the sports performance environment, and they have a lot more tools than what I have in terms of tracking the athletes that they work with for the team sports that they're working in. But ultimately, the data that they're going to present to the coaches of the teams, are those athletes getting faster? Are they getting stronger? How is that going to influence them on game day? And they're only going to cherry pick a couple of points to actually show, look, they've got faster in theory, when it comes to Saturday game day, that they should be able to beat more defenders or whatever it may be. Whereas I think sometimes from the strength side of things, I think, like what we've said about, trying to put as many different exercises in a program and throw the kitchen sink at it. I think, trying to track everything and make sure that everything is on point. Whereas actually, what's actually going to be useful, what is it that's going to influence your decisions, which I think is very important, because sometimes, going back to looking at the research side of things, you can try and replicate all those things and try and put them all in place. Whereas we've touched on it throughout this chat that there's things that are outside of those controllable factors, if you like, that are going to have a little bit more influence on there. So I think that was quite a good an interesting point. The one thing, obviously, you both sort of mentioned about the communication with the lifters and the athletes, and if they're saying about their heavy loads, sometimes they might need just more practice with that. How long? Because I sometimes liken it to a game of chicken. How long are you going to leave it before you think, okay, I'm going to step in and we're now going to change it? Because it might be, in an ideal world, they send a check-in. Okay, this is the issue. This is how the lifter's feeling. This is their thoughts. You make a little adjustment. Happy days. It's going. Sometimes it might take a little bit of a process. So, what have your experiences been, and what have your best practices been in that circumstance?
That's an excellent question, and something I really like to talk about, because I learned this the hard way. So, if one person that's listening to this cannot go through or not make the mistakes that I've made, I see that as a net benefit. So the way that I think about adjustments on a week-to-week basis I'm basically just looking for red flags. And the two primary red flags I'm looking for are, is there an ache or a pain or an injury that has come up that, it's a good idea to really pull them back, which of course is common sense. We should make adjustments in that case. The second red flag is motivation to train or enjoyment so low that their intent to train is just like, it's not there and they're not going to execute the program well. Those are the two primary red flags I'm looking for on a week-to-week basis. Beyond that, I think why I'm hesitant to make massive changes to kind of the plan and the configuration of the training variables on that short of a timescale is because if you do that and then you finish the training cycle, it's going to be very hard when you finish the training cycle to actually have any degree of diagnostic clarity of how things went. Because in week 3, they brought up this minor point of, I didn't feel super confident with heavy loads. So in week 4, we bumped it up. Oh, and then in week 6, they said, I'm feeling a little beat up. I think it's because those heavy sets. And then we bumped it back down. It's like, okay, now we have this training data from the last 12, 13 weeks, however long the training cycle was, but we don't, like, let's say things went well. If it went well, we don't really know what worked, right? If things went poorly, it's a worst of both worlds, because A, you didn't progress, and B, you don't have consistent data to be able to say that, like, oh, the way we configured your programming didn't go well. So I learned that the hard way when I first started coaching people. Is, you want to be in tune with your athletes. You want to show that you care. And I think a lot of that is by, making these small week-to-week adjustments, which again, there's certainly a time and a place, but I think being very trigger happy with those things leads to a decrease in diagnostic clarity. And then once you have sufficient data and you have sufficient feedback, as opposed to just kind of a knee-jerk reaction, then you can take a step back and you say, okay, what's the next step from here? Because, sometimes there's a disassociation between what you're feeling on a week-to-week or a day-to-day basis, and then the way the training cycle ended when you properly went through, your tapering strategy or whatever. So that's kind of my 2 cents is week to week, look for red flags, be in tune with the athlete, but don't be trigger happy with changes.
I think another thing to add color to this is, like, I think often athletes are comparing themselves, the best version of themselves, to where they're at in the current block or cycle. And that's not a fair comparison. That's not really apples to apples. You should probably could be comparing yourself, again, depending on whatever kind of unit of training you use, to a similar context from the previous cycle. And I think generally that's going to lead to a different evaluation than, okay, on week 3 or 4 of this new cycle, I'm objectively the same strength or weaker than I did on the taper or the test of my last cycle. Training isn't going well. When in reality, the fatigue patterns and the way that training is going to kind of manifest, again, going back to our conversation of what does progress even mean, especially that far out from a test or competition. The way that that's going to manifest and whatever data you're looking at to tell you if stuff's working or not is going to be different in different contexts. So I think taking a step back and okay, week 2 of this block and week 2 of this block, I would say on a greater chance than not, the performance is going to be higher if you compare it that way than if you're just looking at, okay, where am I at to the best version of myself recently or my latest PR. And I think that's another kind of piece of context to add to give athletes a little bit more confidence. I've had a conversation with an athlete recently doing this. And this is where I do like to, this is where the data and the spreadsheets and that kind of stuff is really, really helpful. Because if you can take a step back and say over the course of the last 20 some weeks, there is a extremely positive trend line in your progress. There's a little bit of a lull right now, but again, if we compare in similar contexts, you're far and away in a better position than where you were. So we just need to continue to ride this out. We've made some changes this cycle that we need to let's see if those continue to manifest in better positive trends. But if we start changing a ton of stuff now, then we're going to lose that diagnostic clarity, and that's ultimately going to impact where do we go from here after this cycle is completed. So hopefully that just want to always compare apples to apples when we can.
Yeah, as you were saying that, when you both sort of speaking and being able to track progress and look back and see what's going on, I was thinking in my head of, there was a couple of points where, especially through lockdown, training's being up and down. I'm feeling like, well, am I going to get back on the platform? I'm not going to be able to get anywhere near the numbers. And actually, especially this last training block over the last couple of weeks, I kind of looked at the numbers and was thinking, actually, it's not the end of the world, because I know, for a lifter myself and coaching with other athletes, sometimes you do think like, I just want to hit a PB. I just want to hit this number. Whereas actually, you want to save yourself for the platform. That's where it's going to happen. And everything sort of that building up to that, again, a few analogies have been thrown around in this chat is, you want to build that base of the pyramid as big as you can, so that you can build up and build as much strength as you can. So when it comes to the platform, we're going to, build that total, get some PBs in certain lifts. And, it is good to compare. And then, on the topic of, making accurate decisions, and on the individual basis, which has been, the topic throughout this chat, right? This is what can do. This is work. This is how it's gonna develop. And I think, from everything that we've talked about there, I think it's created a really good understanding of the process of, you might have to start out with some generic, template, and then you adjust, and and it's all a process. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, and that's why when people do a 12-week program and think that they're going to get everything, if you could achieve everything that you wanted within powerlifting in a 12-week program, that's all I'd sell. Right, there you go. There's a 12-week program. We're done. Whereas actually, there's it's got to be a journey over a longer period of time. And we've touched on it before of, where you were 3 years ago as a lifter, you're not going to be at the same point. I know I'm not in terms of a lifter. You look back at old training footage, you look back at all the reps, and you think, oh my God. A prime example is I did a volume block, and lifting weights, I was like, no, that can't be the recommended weights for that. But that's where it builds confidence and motivation to do things. So quite a lot of topics covered there, a few tangents thrown in and analogies. But the last question I like to ask for everyone listening, after all of the topics that we've spoken through there, what would be your words of wisdom or take-home points?
So I think, and I was just thinking about this while you're talking, and as we're wrapping this up here, is I think this topic is really cool, not because it's an interesting topic, but also because it's on the fringes of like science and practice. And that's kind of how we started this conversation off. So I think in terms of like take homes for the listener is don't overcomplicate things. Have some sort of systematic approach. Try to understand the basics of best practices for from the research. But if you have data on yourself or on one of your lifters that indicates that what is typically recommended best practices does not work well for this individual, don't like be okay with straying from it, because it's actually an evidence-based opinion to say there are some people that aren't going to respond well to the best practices. And with the way distributions happen, there's going to be people on, there's going to be outliers, right? And there's always going to be some room there beyond just like the normal generic recommendations. So again, that would be two things is, be okay with not being in the averages, and also have some sort of systematic approach. And lastly, see your training cycle through. So or your training block or whatever you're designating as your unit of training. And don't freak out on a week-to-week basis. If you're evaluating progress on a short time scale, all it takes is one weird data point to throw it off. Whereas if you have 20 or if you have like 12 to 20 data points in there, then you can start saying, okay, this is the trend we're seeing. So that would be the last take home is don't freak out on a week-to-week basis. See your training cycle through. And at the very least, if things don't go well, at least you have good information going forward. So that's what comes to mind for me. Zach, go for it, man.
Not too much to add. I just wrote down system is greater than methods is really all I wrote down. So, again, we talked about there's a ton of different ways you could do things. And that's not really what we're talking about. But once you've decided kind of those two principles I talked about, like determine the unit of training or time span that you're going to evaluate things from, and then try to make incremental changes over time, that's going to put you in a really, really, really good spot to kind of hone in what's best for you over time. And as Josh said, there are limitations to the research. We're looking at averages. And when we look at individual data, it spans so large in terms of variation. So it's really, really important to understand that the most generalizable data to you is the data you have on yourself. So having a systematic approach that allows you to extract your individual data in an appropriate manner so that you can compare apples to apples and make those incremental changes towards the outcomes you want at the end of the day is what we're all after. So I think, regardless of where you're at in your training career, having some sort of systematic approach as opposed to this method or this way of programming or, this training program or this frequency is optimal. Like I would say the former is definitely what we want to be chasing rather than the latter.
Yeah, I think that was two great points to finish on. And, I think the topics that were covered and the conversation that we've had, I think there was a lot of great content in there. And a lot of things from myself as a coach and a lifter that sometimes you forget or think that there needs to be more to it than what it is. So yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I was glad that there was a few tangents thrown in there, and I think there was a lot more layers. There was probably a lot more that we could have dived into a little bit more there. But for everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've chatted about, who might want to see the content that you put out there, or even getting involved in coaching with you guys, where can people find you or reach out to you?
Yeah. First of all, before I plug our stuff, just thanks a ton for having us on, and thanks for the chat. It was a lot of fun. Kind of my gauge for how much I enjoyed a podcast or how well I thought it was is, do I have ideas that I'm going to be thinking about for the next few hours? And I definitely think that's the case. Zach has a bunch of notes written down. We're probably going to go train together in like an hour or so, and I'm sure we're going to chat about a bunch of this stuff.
Training for me in quotes.
Yeah, Zach's working his way back up while he struggles to breathe with that collapsed lung. But anyway, it was an honor, man. Thanks for having us on. In terms of where you can find our stuff, data-drivenstrength.com. You can see some articles we have published on there, as well as the stuff we have to offer. And then if you want to kind of see like our central hub with links to like guest articles we've been on or videos we've been featured on, just go to Instagram and click the link trees in our bio. My Instagram is josh.datadrivenstrength and Zach's is zach.datadrivenstrength.
Nothing to add, dude. Just appreciate you having us on. It was a really good chat. And as Josh said, I have a lot of notes, so I'm going to revisit these and hopefully come with some better mental models for myself here too. So appreciate you, man.
Awesome. No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. I know I took a lot from this chat. I felt like, taking notes there and a lot of food for thought. And, that's the whole point of the podcast, put some more information out there on a selfish note for me to learn, but also for coaches and lifters out there to have some, really useful content that they can use, when they're going into the gym, or coaches when they are programming. So really, really appreciate you both taking the time to jump on. For everyone listening, whether you're a coach or a lifter, 100% look at the content that these guys are putting out there. It is really, really useful, and will only make you a better lifter and a better coach. So thanks again. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.